Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, remembers the tragedy of the Holocaust and how it impacted his life forever. The Nuremberg Trials brought a new way to punish those who committed acts of genocide. It gave peace of mind to those who were affected by the Holocaust, knowing that the monsters who hurt them were punished fairly. The triumph of the Nuremberg Trials brought new technology and a new way to punish war criminals because of the tragedy known as the Holocaust.
The Holocaust, while mostly associated with Hitler, was actually run by murderous Nazi war criminals. During World War II, Hitler and his group of Nazis began the eradication of millions of Jews. They believed that the Jews were an unworthy group of people and were a threat to the German race. The Holocaust started with nonviolent measures including disenfranchisement and discrimination against Jews. The spread of anti-Semitism was able to divide the democratic people and lessen their resistance to the Nazi regime. The Nazis placed impediments in the economic lives of Jews and forced them to wear yellow stars of David. Many Jews attempted to change their names to avoid the grasp of the Nazis, so they could travel to America or gain jobs. The Nazis eventually escalated to physical isolation in the ghettos and mass starvation. Those who weren't killed were taken to one of the 40,000 concentration camps, where they were either worked to death or died from gassing chambers and crematoriums. The completion of the Holocaust were the death marches, where Nazi soldiers would send the Jewish people on walks with no food or water. These were used at the end to assist with the prevention of freedom of prisoners. There are many powerful people besides Hitler who ran the Holocaust. Hermann Goering was the most influential person besides Hitler. He was one of the few to attend the high-level meeting following Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was the burning of synagogues and the vandalism of Jewish homes, schools, and businesses. He created the Reichstag fire and arson attack on the Reichstag building, and was known for the Aryanization of Jewish property. Hans Frank, another influential power in Hitler's party, joined the Nazi Party in 1927. He was made Minister and Reich Commissioner for Justice in 1933, and in 1939 he was made Governor of the General Government of Poland. Hans Frank was known as Hitler's personal lawyer and for being the butcher of Warsaw. He sent 2.5 million Jews in slave labor. He also constructed and was in charge of the extermination camps in Poland. The Holocaust was a tragic event, and the Nazis who educated the plan were even worse. Without them, the Nuremberg Trials wouldn't have been created. The Nuremberg Trials were a way for guilty war criminals to be held responsible for the crimes they committed. The Nuremberg Trials started on November 20, 1945, in Nuremberg, Germany. There were 4 judges from 4 countries: Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, and the United States. 22 Nazi war criminals were put on trial and 12 were sentenced to death. Robert Jackson was the first person to speak at the trials, and nothing else spoken at the trials was as of great importance as that speech was. Because of the grandeur of his speech, it has since been quoted many times. Jackson spoke about the spread of anti-Semitism, Hitler, and the government. In the end, 12 were sentenced to death, 3 sentenced to life, 4 were sentenced to 10 to 20 years, and 3 defendants were acquitted. This further proves that the Nuremberg trials were effective because of their way to weed out the major and minor crimes. The judges were able to sentence the war criminals based on the level of extremism of the crimes committed. The last session of the trials was not filmed to keep the defendants' dignity. The Nuremberg trials would have been less effective if the translators had not been in effect. The translators used in the trials were a new way for all countries to understand and listen. The translators were created by the International Military Tribunal. The IMT decided that all people being tried deserved trials in languages they understood. So with that in mind, the translators were created. These translators would convert the language of the speaker to the interpreter and would be spoken through headphones to the judges. At the trials, there were 5 translation channels used. The first channel was the verbatim transmission of the speaker. The words were then translated into English, Russian, French, and German. Each participant in the trial wore headphones, and there were plenty of microphones around the court. One of the interpreters was Siegfried Ramler. He believes the trials would create an acceptance of responsibility. At the trial, he interpreted for Hans Frank and a military interrogator. Hans Frank, who he interpreted, ran occupied Poland and was known as the Butcher of Warsaw. He was Hitler's personal lawyer and was responsible for the murder of 3 million Jews and Poles. Siegfried says that Frank was clear-minded and was fully aware of the destruction he did. Siegfried says that he was shocked at the trial but was not traumatized because he could not put his own emotions into his work. With the help of the translators, the Nuremberg trials paved a way for the future of trials. The Nuremberg trials set a precedent for future trials and court cases, especially during the Rwandan genocide. The Nuremberg trials developed the idea of crimes against humanity, international war crimes tribunals, and making genocide a crime under international law. At Nuremberg, there was a line between warfare and the legality of waging war drawn. This created globalized concern on the attitude of war, which is why Nuremberg was the centerfold for future war trials. For example, at the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948, genocide was criminalized. This convention was influenced by Nuremberg. Additionally, in 1948, the UN issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration recognized human rights. It established rights for citizens suffering in violence. The Nuremberg Trials set the stage for declarations like these, which gave rights to those who were suffering in violence. The UN Charter was also a product of Nuremberg. This charter was signed at the end of the UN Conference on International Organization and has many of the same ideas as the trials did. Overall, many important documents and conventions that save innocent individuals' lives are being created because of the trials. In 1994, in Rwanda, a civil war broke out between ethnic tribes. 500,000 Tutsi and supporters were killed by the Hutu government. The crimes committed were extremely hurtful and couldn't be controlled, so they required the help of the UN. Following the civil war, the statute for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was constructed. The laws and rules for the statute were much more explicit than the International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. This tribunal is the UN court of law that engages with war crimes. It was established in 1993 and provides victims of these crimes with a voice. In court, much like the Nuremberg trials, the court was authorized to prosecute for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The tragedy of the Holocaust led to a new way to fairly punish war criminals and new technology within the Nuremberg trials. Before the Nuremberg trials, many countries would shoot the prisoners of the losing side whether they were guilty or not. With the new invention of the Nuremberg trials, war criminals could be tried fairly to determine their fate. The Holocaust allowed this new plan because of its horrible killing sprees and torture. The translators gave each country and criminal the ability to have the trial in their own language. Overall, these trials set a new stage for the UN Charter and for the future trials across the world.